Do what? I'm okay for now.
That was really good. Oh, it's driving me nuts. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Fred.
All right, I do not see Allie yet.
All right, we'll give it another minute.
No, I'm good.
I'm gonna give it another minute, see if Councilmember Johnson comes online.
Good, thank you.
Do you have one too?
No, mine goes up.
I made mine go up, but it might go
Yes.
down in a minute.
I had a chair like that at work.
Not slouching.
Literally every time I was on like a Zoom call, it would be like, like
That happened to Fred at one of the meetings, that's why I laughed. What was that, a couple months ago? He went, "Whoop," and I laughed out loud, and you all were like, sorry. Fred went down.
so you laughed and now you get that chair.
Yeah, it's like, got you.
Well,
Yeah, I know.
We'll get started. There she jumps
It's so
on.
funny.
Y'all up? A couple more. Hey. Actually, just in time. Let's get ready to start it. No problem. She's on? Perfect.
Next door.
No, he's been just pushing dirt for me.
I know he's been that way for 2 years. Digging a ditch now. I walk by there every morning,
I am with you 100%.
Hi, Allie, can you hear us?
Homer just drove through last week,
No, it's
and
Yeah.
Pizza Street.
I can slightly hear.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
There's a one that's
he
kind of-
decided
weird.
not to stop and see me.
Oh man,
He's like, everything's going fine. She's good.
dang, that's even closer.
Oh, I guess we've been here 13 years. So gonna get that way.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, Cody.
Yeah, I got a burrito from there one time. That big, like that big. I'm like,
Over on Highway
Yeah.
55.
that's like $10.
I haven't
It's like
heard
gonna be
anything,
like 4 meals.
but my husband called me because he drives
And
that
then Maria
big
got
from
one too.
work, and
We
he's
should
like,
just got one cut in half.
let's go. And I'm like, I don't know yet, but I'll let you know if I can.
I'll give them a minute to get some food.
And he's like, well,
started.
oh, this is this, and this is happening.
Sure.
And I'm like,
No, next Friday.
I don't know yet. I'm
Yeah.
like,
Okay.
like, can you give me a
Actually,
minute?
that's
Oh, I was just,
I took that
calm
down.
down.
Well, there you go.
We'll think, but if it's
We're gonna head
what
out
I
to
think it is,
that way.
Okay, nice.
It's resolved now, but I'll fill you in afterwards.
One more trip.
There you go.
I know we've been in,
Yes, I think that's
I'm
great.
trying to think what
That's
I can say.
perfect. Yes.
Have you driven down Highway 85 heading
Okay.
south and look to your left at America's
Thank you.
Best?
Appreciate it.
It looks horrible. Okay, just making sure.
It's not
Yeah.
municipality. So when
I
people
don't know
understand
if,
it at the same time.
anything can be done with community services with it, like, clean it up or else.
Yeah.
But I do know there's been some tagging and all that on there.
Highway 85, pretty much from Spaghetti comes your way south. Roughly, because CDOT hasn't built anything yet.
Well, yeah, I'm looking at the
Right.
businesses.
So
We'll go ahead and go get started, because I know you're gonna do your introduction and everything like that, so hopefully by the time we're done with that, we'll be over here. We got 60 minutes on this, and we got a couple other items that are on here, so let's kind of really try to stick to our timeframes on this. That way we can have some leftover time for any council discussion or anything else anybody else to bring up. So that, let's go ahead and turn it over to you, Cody.
Yes, Mayor and Council, good evening. We have 4 items on the agenda tonight for the work session. We'll have the land use code update. This will be the second installment of this conversation. Then we'll have the third and final conversation at the July 18th meeting. We'll also have a conversation about 2023 water conservation, 2023 potable water usage, and then we'll have a discussion about MPO call for projects coming up. 2023 call for projects. But this first one, land use code update, non-residential standards, access parking standards, and landscaping standards. We have Chris Brewster joining us tonight from Multi-Studio out of Kansas City. He's going to facilitate this part of the conversation. So, Chris, with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor, council members, and planning commissioners. Chris Brewster, I've been working on this project with both Graham and Matt, who you've seen here before from the beginning. So I wanted to go through tonight. We're going to cover the non-residential development and design standards. Turn it on first. That helps. Yes. So just to orient you to the overall code, on the right of the screen, I know it's not necessarily legible, but that's the framework we've been working under. We took your existing code and reorganized it into this glorified table of contents, so to speak, just to know that we're building something that's well organized, makes sense, and the pieces fit in a comprehensive way. And also, we haven't left things out that are important in the existing code. It's probably the most important thing we're going to leave you with in this project, because the code will get amended from time to time as you face issues, and so keeping a logical structure to it is really important to us, and we think it gives it a long shelf life. So tonight what we're talking about are chapters 1806, 07, and 08. We've captured this theme as non-residential development and design standards. 1806 are all your non-residential zoning districts. 07 is parking, and 08 is landscape design. Those last two do touch residential properties too occasionally, but for this purpose we've just lumped them into this conversation because it made sense for these to come as one piece. Then a reminder of everything we're trying to do with your code is to tie it back to your comprehensive plan that was just updated, and so this will become very important to this discussion in particular as we look at the commercial industrial zoning and the concept of the neighborhood centers and community centers that you have in your plan. We typically think of some of the things that are in your plan goals. It's really trying to elevate urban design as an important part of developing, establishing your community image, making places more functional for different types of activities, having more destinations, gathering places, that type of thing, things connected to neighborhoods better than might occur otherwise. And so we tend to boil all the complexity that goes into that in the development world down into that grid right there. That it's 4 types of things. It's either neighborhood serving or larger scale on the top, community serving or even regional serving, and it's either walkable or it's more car oriented. And so if we can just think of trying to hit those 4 targets, it simplifies things down dramatically. And to be honest, in a lot of places we're hitting all of those targets in one area or project. So that's kind of an overall theme. And so then the question is, how do we take some of those land use categories and development patterns from your plan and make your current districts work within that? So that's our task. When we then go to analyze, okay, what make the hardest one to hit obviously is that walkable pattern, because that's what's going to take code interventions or investments that are different than what might otherwise occur. And so some of the attributes that we look for are, does it require or allow very small scale uses? In other words, more smaller things is better than one larger thing for hitting some of those walkability issues. Is it neighborhood serving? Do we have walkable patterns and design? And then is there a residential mix either within the district or very closely integrated to it, rather than maybe buffering from it like you might do in larger scale commercial? So if we take your current zoning districts and kind of check which, based on the intent of the zoning districts, which of these attributes should we be hitting? This is a rough framework for how we've looked at the zoning districts and what are in the development code itself. So the key thing here is particularly in the middle categories, we want to make sure we're just allowing for every every option we can of those 4 quadrants that were on the previous slide. So that's what the bulk of tonight's presentation will be about, of how are we considering all the options while keeping the code flexible and simple. So on that note, this is really that analysis. Nothing that we have in the drafts that were sent out to you all is really a new topic. You're already regulating for all of those topics, either in 1808 040G, which is titled Architectural Standards. When you get in there, there's a long list of subsections of all of these different topics that are running down the left. And then also the Highway 85 overlay, which is a recent intervention that repeats a lot of these same types of topics. So you can tell there's an interest, a desire to elevate some of these community design principles, but it becomes pretty complex, complicated, and hard to follow. So the right of the screen is how we try to simplify it. It's really three main elements are going to drive that. It's your frontage, how the building and site relates to the streetscape, your building itself, and then all the stuff around the building. So if we think in those 3 principles, we can dramatically simplify the regulations. The other thing we can do is we can begin to tailor those to those different contexts, those 4 different quadrants we talked about on the earlier slide. This is a sort of an abstract thing of how we think about development codes, particularly when a plan is calling for increased community design. Design's not an easy topic to regulate, but when we think of it of more of a system of how we build and why, that's what we want your development code to become more of, a clear path to why we do certain things in some areas and do different things in other areas. Whereas above, planners particularly have had a tradition and a history of just thinking of it as a collection of standards, a list of standards. I think that previous slide kind of showed that as well. So then implementing it, the idea of how do we get flexibility, but the most important thing we get out of this code is certainty. We want to make sure we're raising expectations so everyone understands what's required, everyone understands how decisions are made. So those 3 elements on the left were what I talked about, boiling your current standards into some basic types of frontages, types of buildings, types of open spaces. And it's very easy to write a very objective, measurable standard for each of those things. What's not as easy is figuring out where to apply each one, and so that's why the code will have lots of cues on intent statements, applicability, and then on the back end, the review processes. And one of the things we'll talk about with this group is when some of these things aren't being applied properly, do we have flexibility to consider alternatives through your design review processes, whether it's planning commission or elevated to council as well. And we'll come back to this slide as well. Essentially, everything that you'll hear tonight is we've kind of taken out of this book that's written, was written by a person named David Sucher. It's very plain spoken. It talks about, it's mainly focused on if we want to improve walkability. And that's not everywhere in your community, but it certainly is within those circles. The neighborhood center and the community centers are on your plan. And so his 3 principles, if you do these 3 things, build to the sidewalk, in other words, make your buildings and site engage the sidewalk, make the building permeable, in other words, make interesting features, make it connect, have windows, doors, open space, and then prohibit or disguise the parking, have it either on street, to the side, or behind. So his point is if you do those 3 things and nothing else, you will have a successful place if you're shooting for walkability. So those themes carry throughout what we've put into your code. I mentioned before those types. One of the earlier chapters you looked at had street types, so we'd have a range of street types to plan for every context you could encounter, from the more high traffic, high volume streets to the more tame neighborhood streets to even the calm, walkable streets that will be part of these activity centers in the future, hopefully. And then these are the things that I mentioned that it's very easy to write objective standards for them. So the code has defined elements that are easily measurable for each of these things. So when someone hits those standards, it's very easy to just check the box and say approved. When we want to consider alternatives, that's when it could get a little. We need to have a right path for that and make sure the code is working well for those options. So with that, that's kind of more of the framework, the approach, the operating system we've put in place. So the next slides go through some of the specific standards. So what we chose to do was we've been kind of gravitating towards this idea of if we can simply create 4 different types of frontages, and each of them comes along with their own kit of parts of standards for all of those elements we talked about. Now we've narrowed it down to we only have 4 things that we're considering instead of 100 things that we're considering. So obviously the left, frontage A, are the most walkable that you might find in a downtown, or we might find in the heart of your neighborhood or community centers that are listed in the plan. B is still quite walkable, but it allows a few more things to happen and it can get a little bit messier. And then the C and D are different versions of a more drivable context. The key thing here is when we go into a good downtown or good activity centers, you'll often find some of each of these. That's what makes those places work well. So it's going to be important to have flexibility and adaptability to that context. But with that being said, once you allocate which one you're applying, everything else kind of falls along pretty simply behind it. The other part about this is it doesn't take a whole lot of frontage A and B to build a ton of value. So if you think of one of the intersections you have right now that's planned for one of those centers and you just kind of have a hard time seeing it in the context it's in now, you really only need a block or 2 of what's on the left to generate a ton of value for all the other things around it. And that's mainly how most of these systems work. So again, what's in the code is a detailed standard for each of those 5 bullet points regarding each of these 4 frontage types. Then when we move to the building, again, all things that are talked about in some manner in your current code, but we can begin to categorize them in these frontages as well. So wall planes and limiting blank walls, you have standards that are trying to break things up to make them more human scale. That's really, really important on the left hand, the frontage A. It's not quite as important on the right hand on frontage D, or it's important at a different level. The standards can be much more lenient because you're encountering the building from such a further distance when you're in public spaces. So an easy way to think of it is the entrance features. On a main street, you would expect to see an entrance into the building at least every 50 feet or less. On a more automobile-oriented frontage, 1 per building is pretty much all you need. So that, and then everything in between is the idea there. So all of the building design details can follow these frontage types as well. So this table essentially encapsulates all of that. So all of your standards, we were able to boil down to one particular table for each of those frontage types. The sections that then follow that in the draft of Chapter 1806 talk about when to apply them, how, where, and more importantly, gives options for how to meet some of these standards. So there's design techniques. For example, breaking up the wall plane. There's a number in this table, even though it may not be legible on the screen in your packets. There's every 50 linear feet or every 1,000 feet of wall plane area, break up the wall. Well, what does that mean? Well, the sections following it say, well, that means you can do it with architectural features, you can do it by material changes, you can do it by adding elements of entrance features and windows, and so that gives you the roadmap for how to increase the design for that context. Then when you get to the right, it's not quite as important. What does become more important when you move to the right and have a more car-oriented is that's usually when we want to up the landscape standards, the buffers along the streetscape, screening parking that's along the frontage, having better landscape parking for larger parking lots, and those types of things. This is just, so the kind of the question that's probably running through your head now is okay, how do we determine when and how to apply them? The bottom of the table, I just want to spend a little time walking through that. Right now, our concept is that really relying on that plan. And so those activity centers saying that when you're developing in those areas, we would actually expect and want you to be hitting those A and B frontage types. So that's the types of standards that would be permitted just by a site plan and staff review. If you needed to deviate from it for whatever reason, then we could go to a special review process And then the further you get from the standard, then that's the one where we would want some type of conditional site plan review that goes to planning commission and council. Then when we move down to the other districts or outside of these same districts outside of those neighborhood and community centers, it sort of flips. We're assuming that you're going to be in a more automobile-oriented context, and therefore the typical setbacks of those districts apply, and the landscape standards are increased by virtue of them being on the C and D frontages. Not that we wouldn't preclude you from building in that pattern, but we would need an elevated review to make sure it makes sense in that context. And so we would use that review process and criteria to apply those standards. So that's the approach we're taking. The other two chapters, so access and parking, there are a few things in here that relate to that, but then there's also just some general improvements regardless of the goal for implementing the neighborhood and community centers that are just kind of citywide improvements to parking. The first is we have coordinated the access standards with the street design types and also public works standards for access management. So there's things in your current code that we think don't really coordinate that well, or they're kind of a one-size-fits-all standard. And so we've coordinated the access standards in the parking section with that approach I just mentioned above. We've simplified and refined some of the required parking in a few places, not much, but so your required parking table roughly reflects what you have now. Probably the biggest change or newest element is adding more flexibility. So we do have mitigation that would kick in if you require over a certain percentage, or if you provide more than a certain percentage over the minimum amount. So that idea of too much parking can be as big a problem as too little. So there's a threshold for, at a certain scale, we increase the landscape standard because of the amount of parking you've provided, or give other options for mitigation. There's other things listed in that section that can be done to mitigate larger parking lots if people feel they're needed. So these are the ones that are being built, even though it's not required, they're building it anyway. And then on the other side, for people that think that the requirement is too high, we do have some options for reducing that through credits of either if there's on-street parking, so those streets that I mentioned before that you may not have a lot of right now, but as you build new centers around a more connected street network, you might have some of those situations. Or if there's alternatives for bicycle parking, things like that, that there's ability to reduce the parking. And then the last part is the design flexibility. We've taken some of the landscape standards, and one of the things we always try to do is we're not striving to make sure Evans has the best parking lots. And so sometimes that's what standards tend to do, and so they actually increase the visibility and footprint of the parking because of how much space is needed to meet landscape and those types of requirements. So we've tiered that to the size and location of the parking. So if you're building a large parking lot in the front of your building, obviously that's when the landscape and buffer standards should be the highest. However, if you're building a smaller lot, the landscape standards might be smaller so that you're not really, you're getting more building area out of your site. And then as you move to the back or the side of the parking, then those standards go down as well. So having some flexibility based on the content is one of the things we're trying to achieve there. The landscape design standards in 1808, I'm having trouble reading my first bullet point. I think it's standards based on site elements. Yes, thank you. So we broke the standards into streetscape, frontage, parking areas, building and foundation area, and then buffers and screens, all the other leftover spaces. And so we have because we're trying to meet a specific design intent of each of those, we feel it's important to allocate the standard to it. So for example, in the streetscape and frontage areas, it's more important to have trees at a regular interval, and that's something that we can write a very objective standard for. If you're in other areas, it makes more sense to locate trees maybe in clusters, or maybe there might be some other design intent for those areas, and so there's a different type of design standard that would go along with that. So that's one of our reasons for breaking into the site elements. The other is it becomes very easy for applicants to kind of just add up and figure out how much plant materials they need to have with their application based on each of those. The second bullet point I think is also important. There's options for design and location based on context or constraints. So you'll see throughout there that we have either put a priority. So, for example, for street trees, there's a hierarchy of priority. We prefer to have it in the right of way between the sidewalk and the street. All of your streets don't allow that context. So the second fallback is to put it on the outside of the sidewalk. The third fallback is if you have utility constraints, you can put in an ornamental tree at a certain higher rate. So each of those has options built into the code that should be very easy for staff and applicants to interpret. The third one down is we looked at your current buffer standard, and in our mind, there weren't enough distinctions between different buffers, and so we added 3 different types based on what you're trying to achieve. Basically, kind of a low-level screen that's just trying to filter, all the way up to the third being a high-level screen where you're really trying to separate and mitigate impacts and not have in places where you might have some sensitive adjacent uses or buildings going next to each other. And then the last part is coordinating with larger scale public or common spaces. If you get larger projects that are building, an entire quadrant of an intersection or block, there's opportunities for them to insert social spaces and things. I'll skip to this slide for a moment because it's the left hand of the screen. The social spaces are kind of on building open spaces that are more compact but make places really vital. Those are what we see on those A and B frontages, whereas on the C and D frontages, the space, buffers, and landscape become more important. So the standards are kind of geared to fall in line with that as well. Just go back to this one for a minute. So this is essentially that one table has all of the landscape standards in it. So someone could go to this, measure all of these elements on their site, and then they have their landscape budget of exactly how much they need to apply, and then we start to apply them to all those different site elements. So that's kind of all. I threw a lot at you. I'm sure, hopefully you have questions, or I went back to this slide just because Angela and I thought this was kind of the most important one to think about and discuss, but we can skip to any of them. But that's our approach. And I think what we're looking for you all tonight we're always trying to do three things. One, implement your plan, and your plan is calling for a higher level of community design. But 2, we want to make sure the code's flexible, but in doing that, we also want to simplify and make sure people have really high expectations of what's required of them when they come in for an application. So we think we're hitting those with this approach, and we'd be looking for your input on that.
Awesome, thank you. First of all, Planning Commission, thank you so much for being here this evening. Really appreciate it. That way we can all get on the same page, kind of, and develop these processes going forward. So please jump in. If you have any questions or comments, we'd love to hear from you. I'll start with Councilmember Johnson since she's online. If she has any questions or comments that she wants to ask, and then I'll open it up for other questions, comments.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It was really great. I think it's very streamlined and it's easy to follow. And it's definitely a great way for, developers as we continue to develop Evans, for them to have like a framework on what it looks like for them. And I think it's a simplified way to definitely, as you mentioned, have check marks to ensure that specific things are being followed. But one of the things I wanted to ask, I know when you mentioned the parking kind of streetscape, as we continue to grow in Evans, one of the things I didn't hear, and I'm not certain if this is going to come up in any other form at a different time, but bicycle lanes, as we continue to grow and develop in specific areas in Evans, when we consider parking, even if it's, front parking, even think about how that streetscape will look to include that. And again, in Evans, we want to ensure quality of life, which is, access to our community, to different areas within the city, and also, being inclusive of, the different varieties of transportation, which is definitely, people that use bikes and, whether it's recreational or to get to work. How would that look like if, within this model that you've presented, for someone to say, okay, this is what we're thinking in Evans, adding bike lanes to ensure that mobility?
Yes, great question. Most of what you're asking about will be in chapter 1803 or 1804, I believe, the subdivision and community design standards, where we've housed a range of street types and streetscape standards. So in part of the task you're asking about, it's three parts, right? It's a planning part issue, like what is your bike transportation plan doing, or is it a context that's ripe for bikes, or is it just a street where we want to establish bikes as a priority? So there's a planning issue involved first. The second is a capital improvements issue of which streets could be redone or are likely to be redone, and then it becomes a standards question. Do we have the right standard for it? So I'm pretty confident in 1804, if you go to that street section, I think even what we did there was we took all of the functional classes of streets, so the arterial, collector, local, and we put a design type to them. So an arterial might have 3 or 4 different design types. Are you a more traffic-oriented street? Are you a pedestrian-oriented street? And I believe one of the types we termed a bikeway, parkway. And so there's standards in there for that again, are default standards. Like everything in Evans, when you're going to hit contexts where you're already built out or you've built the street. So following those street standards is what we call a complete street design guide, which essentially says, well, your default type maybe had an 80-foot right-of-way and it said the bike lane should be 6 feet wide. We have an 84-foot right-of-way, or we only have a 76-foot right-of-way, or we have a question of should we put on-street parking or not. So that complete street design guide has basically a list of things in a one-page table that says, when you either encounter constraints or when you encounter competing priorities, here's how you can balance those and decide between one or other of those elements. So in the development code, obviously that's best for developers who are building and platting streets. It would be great if it becomes a decision-making tool for the city to plan and design around its own streets for capital improvements and upgrades to your existing streets. It just won't be as nice a fit because you're going into a variety of different rights-of-way and conditions, but it can be a useful tool.
No, I appreciate that. No, thank you. Again, your presentation was excellent. I appreciate it. Even being virtual, it was easy for me to follow. So thank you.
Members of the Planning Commission, do you have anything? I'd like to hear from you guys.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have the code updated as a member of Planning Commission, because a lot of times we'll get things that seem like, why is this coming before us? And whether it's variances that seem like they shouldn't be variances, or things that seem like a no-brainer, like why wouldn't we be able to do that? So I think in some ways that's outdated code, in some ways it's just confusion in how it's written. So I think that's awesome. I liked a couple of the examples that you gave following, for instance, parking location and how that was landscaping requirements. So I think that makes a lot of sense. One thing that I think is so difficult with code is this balance between like permissiveness and restrictiveness. If the code's too permissive, then it's like sloppy, inconsistent development. If it's too restrictive, then we're getting a ton of variances, or people are going around the code. And it seems like that's something that just in the design that you talked about, the structure, that we're trying to strike that balance. So I don't have any concerns with what was presented. I think it'll be a huge improvement, and it'll help us. It's not even like I want less things to come to us. I just want more like impactful, important things. If staff can handle it, I want staff to be able to handle it. And I think that's kind of what I heard.
That's where we're trying to go.
Yeah.
with
Yes.
this. That's exactly what.
Well, that and the planning commission.
Yeah, and
We want them to
exactly.
do
We
their
want you to
job.
even- if
You know.
it's something that needs to come to you, we want to give you guys the power to say yes or no, and then by the time it comes to city council, it's just an agenda item, and we go, cool.
Yeah.
Or
Because,
it
you
shouldn't
guys are
be
really
us.
the experts, in my opinion. You're the ones that are reviewing it in a more high-level detail than we are, for the
Yeah.
most part. And 9 out of 10 times, if you make a recommendation, this is our recommendation, we usually go with it. So we don't need to have a public hearing,
Yes.
when you guys can approve it at a public hearing, comes to council, we're good.
Yeah, exactly. And good code makes our jobs a lot easier.
Exactly. Yeah. Can you go back a couple slides to where you were talking about the landscaping for me? One of the things that really popped out was the tree thing. And I know Councilmember Spear probably will be on this too. I don't mind trees, I don't mind shrubbery, I don't mind any of that. I also want to reduce it and start going to more native, xeriscaping, et cetera. Because one of the things, and I know this has been a thing for numerous years since I've been here, we have a hard time maintaining, even on the city side, trees, shrubbery, etc. I don't want to have all of these people burdened with landscaping of trees, brushes, even the city, but that where we can go to less restrictive, something that doesn't need to be watered or very little water. So I would like to see probably changes in that to where we eliminate the number of trees, the number of shrubberies, etc., and just have it open to where you want to xeriscape it and it looks aesthetically pleasing, we're good with it. So.
Can I comment about that? So I really like that. It makes sense, but could we, I mean, what's the cost of a tree versus a large rock? And what can a large rock do compared to a large tree? Zero maintenance. You get a tall pillar of a rock, you know rocks are expensive, they're also heavy, but where's the flexibility in maybe working with a different material for screening?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no,
Right, that's
that's
what
what
we
I'm trying
want.
to see. Give that flexibility where it's just
Yeah.
not, we have to have trees and shrubs in every little, give it that flexibility. If you wanted a xeriscape, you want to do trees, as long as it is aesthetically pleasing and it kind of goes with the flow, just don't have to have trees and brushes, just have trees and brushes. Yes.
Yes.
So one of my questions is, I know we do not have a city forester, but when we start talking about decisions between xeriscape and rock, part of the problem with rock and doing that is that you're creating a heat sink. So it heats up and then it radiates heat throughout the day. So the balance between, I feel like, and I see this all over the city, people planting inappropriate plants, inappropriate trees, and then the trees die, the plants die, it looks like caca. And I really like to see us have something in the city, someone knowledgeable who can say, these are appropriate plants. For instance, our Plant Select, which our CSU does this 3-year study of plants that will grow with a minimal amount of water. Xeriscape does not mean just rock.
Right,
Plenty
right,
of
yeah.
plants, but without someone here who is knowledgeable, who can take the hand of the developers and say, plant this, not this. You know, we're kind of, I'm looking at the Excel building. They're on their 3rd round of dead trees.
And that's
Yeah.
what I don't want to have either.
Yeah,
and that's the
exactly.
thing. Where's the balance? And that's why I said even native. You know,
Right,
stuff that's-
well, and there
yeah.
is native, and
Yeah.
there are many appropriate plants and trees that we can plant, but it's gonna take someone within the city, I feel like, who's knowledgeable, who can kind of say yes, no, yes, no.
But a
I've seen
developer
every
could hire their own person to
Will they?
find those plants.
Will they?
I'm just saying they can make a standard, but to try to put it all on the city, then you have one person trying to direct all these developers to whatever, and maybe that wouldn't be so good for one person.
Is there
Well, I
an
seem
opinion on
to
how
recall that we
we
were
do that in code?
going to use Greeley's forester, horticulturist as a consultant in those times, since we can't afford to
That
put
would
one
be
on
great.
staff. I know that was a couple of years ago, that was a vision that the former city manager had, was to have one on staff. I also know that a long time ago on the east edge of the dog park, that area there was designated as where we were going to grow our own trees at that point in time. But I do recall that we had some conversation that we would use them as a consultant.
I remember that.
We could
I
use
think
them.
I
Well, and I
remember.
know Greeley has, not only they have a forester, but they have a
Right.
volunteer tree team. So I think that this is something that maybe it becomes a volunteer. We bring in some of the master gardeners. I don't know, but I know that my experience with the city and watching the landscape as just, a citizen, is a lot of times it's
specialist who actually is on staff. So, so I just, you know, it's really amazing to realize her skills and knowledge, and that she's already here with us. And so this is great to have her getting involved on the planning side of things and maybe helping us with having a list. Yeah.
Yeah.
So where can we find these lists?
We are currently investigating partnering with Greeley. They have a really wonderful plant database of their approved plants. It's a lot more expansive than our current approved plant list. Ours is a little bit outdated. And that's sort of where you end up with trees that maybe don't grow as well here anymore. And so that's something that we're looking at. It's a really great resource both for developers and residents as well, because it is incredibly searchable. You can say like, I want a plant that grows in the shade, and that will have foliage in the winter. And so it's like a really great resource.
So with that being what you just said, so why don't we just incorporate Greeley's plant list?
Yes, and
into
so we're
ours,
actually
and that would
yeah.
probably solve that entire thing.
We're in the works right now of partnering on that plant database with them.
So can we?
And then
Go ahead.
can I also add, I'm not certain who mentioned the plant information and regarding that flexibility, but yes, I totally agree with that person. Sorry, I'm virtual, I cannot see you. But I do agree, especially when it comes to having that flexibility. I think we also want to ensure that we protect even like, specific areas within our city, because as we grow, we have areas that have been established for a long time, as well as areas that kind of have been established for some time, and then the newer areas. But we also want to ensure that throughout our city, we are protecting vulnerable populations, because again, as mentioned, trees create a canopy that help with hotter temperatures. And so we also want to be cognizant of that as well. Granted, I do understand within our city how it's been difficult for us to take care of our trees, but definitely those ideas and suggestions to partner with Greeley, or even have volunteers or partner with CSU, that is fantastic, and I'm definitely for that. But I do agree with the flexibility, but just ensuring that the option is definitely there for either or.
I have a question too on like, this is maybe getting a little bit outside of the code conversation, but on enforcement, right? I know code enforcement, you can't have a tree that's clearly dead. Sometimes that's hard to determine, is it really dead? And that makes their job kind of difficult. But just tree maintenance, I don't know how much power we have outside of like maybe a warranty period where the developer puts in a tree. If it dies within X amount of time, are we going back and saying you have to replant that tree? Like, do we have a management process for that? Are we doing that today?
That's a really good question. So we have the right to do it. We have a 2-year warranty where we can replace it, but once that warranty's done, it's really on the site plan itself. Right now, we haven't had staff directed towards the enforcement of site plans just because we have been busy with other things. But it is on the radar, and it's one of the things that our code enforcement would like to expand to. I know we've been talking about it for a while, where they would make a rotation of checking sites and making sure they're like in compliance with their plans. And landscaping is one of those. That's one of the things we get complaints about the most from our commercial businesses. People call us, but we don't. And then we usually enforce that way. Like,
Sure.
for example, yeah, we have a couple places in town right now that I know have open violations that they've gotten their notices and they have to fix their landscaping within a certain amount of time.
But having the right plans from the beginning, I mean, getting that access point is so critical. And I think there are a couple really good examples just on 37th Street, that storage facility. That looks great, right? It's salvia, it's things that do really well. In contrast, and I don't want to like rock the boat here, but the city seems to have taken out all of the landscaping on 37th and just put big boulders and cobble. It's all rock. I personally don't think that looks very good. I know it's maintenance, I know it's important, but are we even following our own aesthetics or what we want to see? There's no grasses in there. I don't know how that decision was
That would
made.
be a hard one to mow though, because it's on a steep incline.
Right, so you do things that don't require mowing, right? And this is like part of that question is like, what look are we going for?
And I do like the rock personally. I like plants, but I also like that, dealing with a lot of development and stuff. I think you've got so much, especially along roadways, relative to snow removal and the things that companies kick up there, that sometimes I think having those options would be great. My concern would be having options, right? Like you could do A or B. What makes the most sense based on your location, based off of potential kickback from the road, based off of whatever it is. Yeah, water, all of those sorts of things. That would be advantageous to not only the aesthetic appeal, but also to the business coming in or the developer bringing that piece in. So I think having that flexibility to a point in that would be great, and having.
And the rock is certainly better than unmowed grass. So, and
Right.
I understand that that's a challenging location, but yeah, it's like a scale.
Mm-hmm.
Well, sorry.
No.
I need to step on. I think that's where the hand in hand comes in. So, there are areas where you're plowing, you're doing things like that, you're pushing a lot of things up on the soil. There are plants that would be appropriate in that kind of area. And you can put trees and rock, but you can't bring the rock all the way up to the tree trunk. It's just a matter of education and putting the knowledgeable people making them available as a resource to those builders and those developers and, who may not know. Because if you're just saying, okay, you have to have a tree, here, here, and here, there's a whole bunch of information that's being left out that is critical to the success of, that landscape. It just is crazy
Right.
to spend the amount of time and money that we do chasing things just because, people don't know.
Right, no, I think those are great points. And to Mayor Pro Tem's, comment as well, I think that's where we need that balance, we also need that education, all that stuff. If this is what we're gonna do, that's fine, we provide the education piece, as you mentioned, and also have that flexibility depending on where it's at. So
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
those are all great points there, and something we have to take into consideration.
And it sounds like the code is implementing some of these things, which is
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, the one thing I think I'm taking away from this conversation, which is great, the first part of the regionally appropriate and low water, I think we have that covered. There's some Zurich standards in there that I believe are the Denver Water Wise, the Dr. Cog, they're really effective strategies. The second would be, we had a note that you have a current plant list that we had a note to ourselves to just verify if that's good. So if there's already things in the works to partner with Greeley or the CSU extension, if it's not already, that would be good. The one thing I would say from a code standpoint that we would do is it might be better to either refer to that resource or delegate to staff to update that periodically so it doesn't become a code amendment.
Yes.
And so if that person can just do that and keep it up to date, and then you all can call it up if there's a problem, that might be an effective strategy. And then in doing that, I don't know how far Greeley is, and it becomes a staff and enforcement thing when things die, and that's always a challenge. But the one thing the landscape architect that works in our group has always schooled us on is, and you're kind of getting to it, that it's really, you can pick the right species, you can pick the right location, you can pick the right everything. If you don't have the planting specifications right, which are highly detailed things that you would never find in a code, and they're hard to go out and enforce because you can't have someone sitting there watching the developer plant it, those are the most important. So if Greeley has specifications, not just the list that could go along with that, we would highly encourage you to incorporate those as well, because that is something that you can give a developer and say, don't plant it in compacted soils, don't plant it in rock. Here's how you plant it, and then if you find they didn't, then enforcement becomes that much easier.
Take the burlap off the wire cage.
Anybody else, council side? Go ahead.
Yeah, past city councils have been very inflexible on this policy. And example, when they did Come and Go on 37th Street, they actually fought and required the developer to put in more trees and bushes than what was in their original site plan. And they were just totally unflexible on what they put in.
And I think that leads us to where we've been today, and we need to fix that. We should not have developers at all coming into the city and going, why are you being so inflexible when I can go across the street and it's there for me. It shouldn't be like that. It should actually be simpler coming here than it is going over there.
If you got good design standards,
Yeah.
and with some flexibility in, that's what we need.
Yeah, that's great.
Anybody else?
Great job.
Yeah, no, I really like the direction we're going and everything like that. And I really do like the fact, as stated earlier, that put a lot of what we can on the staff and the big, larger items, go through planning commission, give them more of the power to approve that stuff. And then by the time it comes to city council, it's an agenda item. We bless it, we move on. So.
Thanks.
Great.
Thanks for
Thank
your
you.
time and
Appreciate it.
discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks for including us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, thank
Thank
you
you
for
for
being here.
coming.
Appreciate it. Yeah, it's
No,
all good.
thank you
Make
for
yourself-
coming.
Make sure you grab yourself a plate of food before you leave. You want some?
Oh, absolutely. I've never turned down food. in my
There
life.
you go. Oh, all right. A little ahead of schedule, which is great, so we'll take it. We'll move on to item number 2, which is the 2023 Water Conservation Program update. And Justine's back.
All right, thank you. I am here as an update. We're about halfway through our season of water conservation programs this year. And so I just wanted to provide a bit of an update of where we are. So first we have our fixture replacement program. This one is complete for the year. We worked with the Larimer County Conservation Corps again. We were able to upgrade 1 toilet, 2 shower heads, and 3 faucet aerators per home. And we were able to do 22 assessments, and of those, we had 18 toilets installed. From that work, it's an estimated 360,000 gallons water saved per year, which is a pretty big difference. Toilets in particular are a really big bang for your buck item in terms of water conservation. And then I just wanted to compare 2022 to 2023. So we did serve less households. That was just because the Larimer County Conservation Corps could only fit us in for 22 assessments instead of the 50 we did last year. And we're already working this year to ensure that next year we're able to serve more households because there is a ton of demand in Evans for this program. It's really popular. One thing that's great though, you'll see, is that we did install a higher percentage of toilets per household. They implemented a new survey at the application point this year so that people had to submit a photo so they could see if there were going to be any problems, which led to a higher percentage of toilet installations. Next, we have our Garden in a Box program. These are garden kits that provide water-wise landscaping for residents. They're really easy to purchase and install on your own. And so far, we've sold 20 of our 25 discounted kits. 21 of our 25 discounted kits. And once we sell all 25, that will be an estimated 60,000 gallons water saved per year. That is, of course, after establishment, because you do have to water them for the first 2 to 3 years. If people install them this year, they've gotten very lucky and have had lots of rain. They have not had to water them very much.
So
Should probably say more than 60.
Yes, this year.
are you planning to restock those after they're 25 are gone?
So we're ending the season. As you can see, we have 4 discounts left, and they just went on sale for their second round last week. And so they typically will sell out in the next week or two. So we're kind of right on target with that amount of 25. You'll see in 2022, that was our first year running the program, so we really had to estimate what our demand was going to be. We estimated we might sell 40 of those discounts. Last year we did sell exactly 25, and so we went in with 25 this year to ensure that we're able to sell those because we do have to purchase those discounts up front. The lawn replacement program was new this year per the little sparkle. This is where residents get up to $500 for a landscape renovation project. We had funding for up to 20 projects. Applications are still open for that until mid-July. And so far we've had 7 applications, and 3 of their projects have removed their turf and put in those garden boxes. Basically they can spend their $500 either towards turf removal or towards purchasing Waterwise garden kits, based on kind of how they want to allocate that money, if they want to do the work themselves to remove that turf, those sorts of things. Yeah, it's a really great program. Yeah, and so with up to 20 projects, depending on their size, that could be an estimated 100,000 gallons of water saved per year. Our last program is the Slow the Flow sprinkler evaluations. Those provide an assessment for irrigation efficiency. They're available to both residents and HOAs and commercial properties. We have 50 appointments available. Kind of the ratio of 1 residential property is different than 1 commercial property, and so we do only have funding for 50 of those, but it could be less if we have a number of commercial properties participate, and that is an estimated 250,000 gallons of water saved per year. Last year we had up to 50 of those appointments available as well, and 30 residents participated. This year, the appointments have just opened. They run all the way through September. And so we kept that 50 just again so that we could have a ratio of commercial and residential properties. We didn't want to run out of funding if a larger property came on. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Awesome, great, thank you. Councilmember Johnson, any questions, comments?
No, this is great. I'm excited that we continue to do these conservation efforts. One of the things I know that with the lawn, the lawn program, lawn care program, you said it stated it just opened. Are we also promoting this on social media so our community is aware of that program as we continue to move forward? I know we've kind of changed and revamped our communication efforts, through social media as well as, our website, but I just wanted to ensure that we're doing that. Also, another thing that was mentioned, no, I think you did mention it. No, I think that is all that I have. I think this is great that we continue our efforts in the water conservation, arena, and that we're doing this every single year. And it seems as though every single year something new is kind of popping up, a new program, and it's exciting to have you, Justine, as part of our team to see these efforts continue to grow and evolve and provide more resources to our community. So thank you.
Great, thank you. And yes, it is on social media, and we have also been sending some bill inserts in water bills to kind of get the word out about these programs.
I've seen them.
Awesome, thank you.
Any other questions, comments?
Yes, I have a question. What does the kit consist of?
Yeah, so it's kind of a vague term. It's a cardboard box that comes with all of your starter plants. And so they're meant to be then put into a garden bed on the ground, not like a raised garden box. And so it's just a kit of starter plants.
Thank you for the
Do we have any requirements that we follow up with on the lawn replacement program? And in my mind, I'm seeing someone getting paid $500 to turn their front lawn into a parking area.
Yeah.
So, I mean, are we making sure that it's going to replacement landscaping?
Yes.
Or something just as aesthetically appealing as lawn?
Yes. With this program, because it's managed by Resource Central, they do have to replace the area with those garden in a box kits. So they're able to put their funding directly towards that. They actually don't approve, you can't like put in a patio or leave it bare. And so to get the funding from Resource Central, they do have to put in those kits from Resource Central.
Okay. So are they having to buy the kits in addition?
So
Taking
that's
that
kind
out?
of what their $500 can go towards.
Okay.
Or they can spend some of it on the lawn removal process and some of it on the kits. Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna go back to my report that I got finally from dated August of 1999 on the non-potable irrigation master plan. And I know Mark is upset that I'm bringing this up. It's old, but
I'm just letting you know, it's 2023.
I know this.
It's only 24 years ago. But no, I'm just giving you a hard time.
But my point is, Councilwoman Spear has constantly reminded us that we're, in the past, they've used consultants for this, that, and the other, $100,000, and they take this and throw it on the shelf to gather dust. And some of it, the reasons why they do some of these things is might be required by the state or the feds to have these studies done. But as near as I can tell, not one of these projects was done. It's all projects that conserve water for the city of Evans, not any residential areas. It's all for the city of Evans. I have been lied to by past mayors and city council members and city staff about this. I have been told that some of this would take 30-year payback period, and it would not, they could not do it. But this study clearly indicates that there are many projects that have only a 2-year payback period. Some 3, 4, and on down the line, up the line for payback periods. In the conclusions, one of the conclusions was the sites that have low payback periods and the potential to generate revenue should be constructed as soon as possible. And as far as I can determine, nothing from this has been done. And I still think that some of these projects, granted, probably the cost has gone up considerably, but I'd be willing to bet that they would generate roughly the same, some of them would generate roughly the same payback period, even now. And it's kind of ridiculous to me to ask the residents that serve water when the city's not doing it. They just may not know that.
I get you. I get you. I'm there with you, but you know, we as this council, and myself and this staff, I mean, we're working with what we got, and we're trying to improve it as much as we can with what we have. I mean, I understand things that happened 30 plus years ago. None of us, you were here, I know most of us probably weren't, Councilmember Spear was here, but we can only work with what we got and implement what we have and do the best we can to.
I guess what I'm suggesting is maybe we should have someone take a look at this report and see if some of these projects are a viable project with just a 2-year payback period.
You have staff you can provide it to. Yeah, have them look into it. No problem with that whatsoever.
I think this is fantastic. I think one of the concerns, maybe I voiced last year, but I'll voice again, and it has nothing to do with what you're doing. I think this is great. HOAs. So the HOA I'm blessed to live in gives us very strict guidelines as to our landscaping, which has to have so many bushes in so many places that just die and look horrendous and grow spiders. So some of us just take it upon ourselves to go, well, if I'm not going to get a fine. But I would love to see some more outreach with those HOAs to provide relative information on things like this, the turf removal and that sort of thing. I think of areas in my yard that would actually be really beneficial and beautiful, but I don't know that the HOA would allow it. In fact, I'm certain they would not. So it would be great to work with them to mirror their expectations to things that the city allows, particularly around water conservation, because I think it's hypercritical as we move forward with those pieces. The other question I have, and it's kind of funny, is so it's with the Larimer County Conservation Corps. Being in Weld County, first of all, I'm assuming there aren't relative resources than in Weld County. And second of all, is there a risk that we could at some point lose that connection because we're in Weld County?
And so that's actually something that we're investigating this summer because of their lack of availability this year for communities outside of Larimer County. Previously, Weld County did not want to take on the risk of that type of project of installing toilets. But I think after seeing this work being done and seeing that there's a clear demand in Evans and Greeley for these programs, we actually are kind of starting discussions with them if for next year if they would consider doing that work again.
Great.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
And then as far as the HOA outreach as well, there was actually just a House bill passed where HOAs cannot, disallow xeriscaping.
They already love it anyways. So.
They do still have to approve that landscape plan though, so it can be tricky.
And and part of that makes sense, but I am happy to hear that because that's problematic.
And so that could be a great opportunity for us with our new landscaping code and everything to come in and kind of, touch base with them on water conservation practices.
Right.
That.
I think that's
well, for like my HOA, there's people that complain about certain things, and the HOA, they say it's in the bylaws, but then the HOA says, "Oh, we don't take care of that. The city does." Well, then, yeah, they should align with you all. So I don't know who runs Laura's. Mine's Greeley Community Management, and they run the Ridge at Prairie View. But definitely check with them. I know they have a few others in our city. So I haven't seen anything, I don't know about you, from my HOA about anything. So
I mean, I've got my original documents from when I bought my house. It wasn't in 1999, but it was a while ago.
Justine, my also HOA is the same one. Is there a way, I know that we started this program, some of these programs as of last year, but I know we're also going to head into the potable water usage, but are we able to kind of get from you like some sort of kind of like grasp of some sort of like who we have helped and how that has helped with water conservation, and so in essence helping us get below the cap when using potable water, because not everyone is on non-pot clearly, and so just to see kind of those data sets, just to see like, hey, this is how how it's helping us with water. Granted, I know we have helped X amount of people, but having a figure of gallons makes also a big difference. And just to touch on the HOAs, I do have to say my HOA, which is also run by the Greeley Community Management, one of the conversations with the HOA board was water, and they realized that they didn't start to water until a later point because we are on non-pot during the summer, and those are typically when our water bill would go up higher. And so they realized, they put together a plan based off of all of that. But I think also just the outreach, as was mentioned, would be definitely beneficial, because sometimes the boards, again, are new or they haven't been in the area, just like with everything else, and they don't have that knowledge. So it'd be great for them to know. And that can definitely help especially with their water conservation efforts. And not only that, one of the biggest drives in increasing the HOAs is the water component.
Yeah, absolutely. And as far as some of those graphs as well, we are wrapping up our water conservation metrics program actually. And so we will have some more findings and some better metrics for these water conservation programs coming out in the next year. Sometimes it can take a few years to see those water savings, for instance, with landscape conversions, but we can definitely work with Rick to get you some kind of CAP and water conservation graphs together.
That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
I found that the majority of HOA boards, the people that control them, are totally inflexible. They have a certain idea of what they want, and sometimes have a tendency to congregate in one section of the HOA property, and that section is better maintained than the rest of it.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Mayor, real
Yes,
quick,
sir.
if I may, would you like for us to take a look at Councilmember Neal's report from
Sure.
98, 99?
Yeah,
Check the validity, we can report back.
absolutely. That'd be great.
I was in college in Chattanooga. Sorry. Didn't know.
I think I would say it was your main.
But I do.
All right, next item on the list, item number 3, 2023 potable water usage and projection cap effects. Oh, thank you. Homework.
We took some
I got an
last
F.
time.
I just give myself an F. Fantastic.
I'm an overachiever. I want a gold star, so lay it on
For
me.
fantastic. I used to tell my
I
kids,
grade
"You
on
got
the
Fs,
curve, though."
fantastic.
Oh, Lord help me. That's not fair.
Why'd you come home with 5 Fs and 1 A? 5 fantastics.
That's one way to think of it.
Periodically, typically at the end of each of the quarters, staff presents water usage for the past months. And in the 6 years that I've been with the city, I think this is the most pleasurable announcement or update. We probably know that in April and May, we had record rains. And what we're finding, if you go to the next slide, please. If you look at towards the far side of it, 2020 was the year that we remember is that we were getting very close to exceeding the cap. It was extremely hot and dry in the spring. The following year, we dropped our usage by 6.9%. And then going from 21 to 22 to last year of our reported, we went up just a 2% increase. The 5-year average that we have is about 5.2% below the cap. That's about 144 acre feet of water. If we go to the next slide. Oop, I'm sorry. If you go back to the previous one, I'm sorry. In your handouts, we have a little bit more detailed information on 2023 to date. We have in the handouts, we have the report up to the reported values up through April. And we have, last year, we had 182.9 acre feet of demand. And this year we did 147.8, which is about a 20% savings. Also, as you recall, each year we project each month, we project each year using a 2% increase. And what we have projected for April and what actually was reported was a savings of 20%. So there's what we actually used versus what we projected. Now, if we continue this out for the rest of the year, then we're projecting that we would have about a 0.3% increase for 2023 than we did for 2022. And just this morning, I happened to get in the figures for the month of May, which I was hoping to get. That's even better news. For the reported versus the projected, we were down 25%. So if we projected out what we have now, then we would have a 2.6% decrease in 2023 versus 2022. So even if we continued out for the months of June, July, August, September through December at 2% more than what we did last year, we're still going to be below what we did for last year. And I've also verified that the city has not turned on its non-pot system to any of our parks and open spaces. That saved us a lot. And we had converted over to the potable use of non-pot June 15th. And I think the records that are showing that what we're seeing here is that people are just not needing to water their yards. So I think going forward, it looks very, very good for this year. Based upon our projection going forward in 2023, then we projected out, the next slide please. We projected out for what it's going to be through the year 2028. Again, projecting 2% growth for each of the years. And in those, we projected that in the year 2026, that we would exceed the cap by about 26 acre feet. That would, at that rate, would be an expenditure of about $710,000. I did quickly, before the meeting, I did the math based upon our new May result. It pushed it out to 2028. So it's very sensitive as far as if we have a couple of lower usage months, how sensitive it is that it pushes out when we would actually exceed the cap. So I think if we continue on this, then we'll probably see it extended out, a projection in 27, possibly 28. So things are really looking good.
I have a question regarding that though. When does Central Well then come online? I thought that was the whole point, is to partner with them to have another treated source to help us stay below that cap. And with that renegotiated contract with Greeley, that was there as a preventative measure.
Right.
For the cap. When
Central Well would come on when our demand and need for water south of the river becomes a reality, and or in looking at using Central Well water on the west side of town and north of the river. So, but those two items, having them are going to keep us also below the cap. So projecting forward, and the financials on it is, again, reiterating that based upon what we saw, 2026, we'd have an expenditure of about $710,000. And that's in line with what finance has been putting away. I don't recall right off the top of my head, but I think it's right at $3 million we have put away for those. So I would gladly accept any questions.
Councilmember Johnson? Questions, comments?
I have comments. This is great. I mean, as you mentioned, it is very sensitive since it continues to push it out, even if with a slight, change with weather and our meteorology. But I mean, I think this is great because I know before we were looking at the cap at 2025, and it looks like now it's been pushed a year. And again, as you mentioned, it's based on, how things look. But so far, so good. I mean, this is looking good, and I'm just excited that, with our water conservation efforts and how things are going currently, and as long as we become intentional of how we grow, I think we will see positive results as we move forward. So thank you.
Thanks. Any additional questions, comments?
I guess my question is, while I think this is great, this year is historically wet, leading to some of the savings we're seeing. How does this model take into account that piece of it? Because if we base an increase off of 2021, let's say, versus 2022 versus 2023 sort of thing, looking at a more average year and usage, are we still really recognizing some excess time on meeting that cap? Or do we anticipate that if next year it's dry again and that we go back to kind of a more average year, we could in fact close that gap a little?
We could close the gap if we had a really, really bad dry year. We could close it. We'd be back like we were in 2020. But with the advent of more and more of our non-pot systems coming on board and the savings that we saw just from Tracto,
right.
We really have that going in our favor. And in tracking, working with staff to try to see exactly how much water we're actually putting out into the non-pot systems of non-pot water, and tracking that, that and the Evans ditch water, that's where we're seeing a real savings in that people have an alternative to that amount of water.
Right.
So
perfect.
Mine was somewhat similar to her question, and I think 2020 was an anomaly year. That was the summer that everybody was home. Everybody had gardens. Everybody decided that was the year that their yard was going to look fantastic. So I think that based on that knowledge, that somewhere along the line, we need to have that in the back of our mind on planning what happens with the next pandemic, the next time we're shut down. What happens, in those situations where we see that surge, and I think that we need to be prepared for, again, another 2020, whether it's drought or another pandemic or something. So I just wanted to point out that 2020 was a little bit of an anomaly, but it could happen again.
yeah, and I mean, the history shows the last slide, if you would go to that, it should show when we've actually paid for the cap.
Oh, yeah.
And then my other thing is if the cap is, if we're paying $750,000 on an anomaly year, I guess I wouldn't want to spend millions of dollars prohibiting the anomaly, or what do I want to say? If 1 year out of every 20 we pay $750,000, it would seem kind of silly to go and spend $5 million on a different program to save money. That may or may not happen.
Yeah,
it's kind of a balancing, but just keeping that in mind. That,
yeah.
Which I'm sure you guys.
It's like, yeah, if you play with the numbers, you can get it to tell you whatever you want. And that's why when you say we use 2% growth, well, if this is an odd year, maybe to protect us, we'll go 2.5% and run the numbers and see where we hit, where we would break the cap, to be prepared to make certain that we do have that money there in case we do that. But I think going on to your point that we want, when we do reach the cap and we have to spend $750,000, do we spend another $1 million on top of that at today's rate to see and build even more cushion. Well, maybe we won't use that for the next 20 years and we spend it, and that's part of what we've done is look at, should we pay money up front now? Does that save us money? So I think we just need to revisit that. When do we pay? Do we pay more than what we need? If so, by how much?
Or is it more cost efficient to put that money into refurbishing the existing non-potable systems that people cannot use or don't want to use in some cases? So I think we need to look into that at some point in time too.
Yeah. And metering those that aren't metered.
Absolutely.
I use less. I like what, so, and I think I agree with what everyone said. And it's, because there's meteorology, there is, pandemics that occur, and there's no way to assess when that will occur. But I mean, we can see trends as well. But then, pandemic, that's a trend that has not happened. But meteorology is one that does happen. But I do agree with the efforts of, utilizing monies to definitely, retrofit or fix or provide means to the non-pot would definitely be advantageous, because right now moving forward, it's just how can we be solution based and ensure that we're moving in an upward trajectory to ensure that we are at this positive, and so far so good. But I think with those continued efforts in mitigating other areas that can help with this consistent trend would help.
Yep.
Do we have, sorry, go ahead, Fred. I was just gonna ask, do we have, we may not have enough data yet, but I would love to know the impact of bringing Tuscany to non-pot. Gallons used of potable water that were then converted to gallons used of non-potable water. It would be great to know that impact, because that has a direct impact on this. And knowing that, then you could almost have a calculation of a per home impact that could then lend itself well to other areas.
Yeah, we can determine how much true non-pot we've actually put on the lawns.
Yeah.
And that equates to what we didn't have to treat.
I think that would be great to understand, because particularly in those areas that are still utilizing potable water, it would be good to know how much of an impact that could have on this.
Did we ever get the Verge to repair their pump and check the contract to see if, as I recall, the land that Dollar General purchased was supposed to be fed by the Verge non-pot, because originally the Verge was going to, quote unquote, build a strip mall there for the convenience of their residents. Didn't happen.
I verified that they actually did make the repairs, and the last that I had heard is they were online and were pumping it again, and that Dollar General was part of that, and they had their own separate non-pot meter. So I'll verify that again.
Great.
Great, thank you, Rich.
Anything else? Great, thanks, Rick, appreciate it.
Yeah,
You bet.
absolutely.
And last but certainly not least, my favorite thing, the call for projects this year. So for the North Front Range MPO, call for projects for 2023.
Good evening, Mayor, members of council. So yes, the call for projects opens up in August of this year. As you know, we're currently funding our roundabout with federal money through the call for the MPO. We've been approved for federal funding for phase 3, which is out of 65th Avenue, for federal funding in 2025. This call is for projects in 26 and 27. So in looking at the projects, the way we've got them broken out right now, you've got an exhibit in your packet showing phases 1, 2, 2A, 2B, 3, 4, and now a 5. What we're thinking about doing is, one of the things that makes projects attractive to the MPO is areas where we can improve efficiencies, and efficiencies usually happen at intersections. And during the design, the preliminary design of 37th Street widening, I had Roxall do some looking at the intersection as to what it would need based on the ultimate build-out in 20 years. We didn't anticipate that we would be doing it this soon, because 20 years is a long ways out, and needing those additional lanes may not be. But if the money's available and we can use that money to improve the overall budget efficiency of the city, that seemed to make sense to us. So we ran some numbers, put some numbers together to look at what it might cost, and we're looking at potentially asking for $1.5 million to construct in 2027 with a match, local, regular match and overmatch amounting to a total of about $1 million from the city. We would have to finish the design into the intersection because we've only designed up to the west side of the intersection at this point. So that would have to be part of the budget in either 25 or 26 so that it was ready for construction in 2027. So that's kind of what we're looking at. Right now, we're moving forward with the other phases of design. We have 2A and 2B essentially complete at this point. 3 is undergoing, and we should have it done by the end of the year. So if we go for this call for projects and ask for money on this project, we would process it and then get going into putting out an RFP to do the design, et cetera. So it does make better use of the federal funding, because one of the big things with federal funding is there's a lot of sound issues that they want studied. And in that middle area of 2A and 2B, there's a lot of residences that back right up to 37th Street. And we've even had calls about noise. But it's not a highway. It's not interstate. It's a 35, and we are reducing the speed limit in that corridor when we finish the project to 35 miles an hour. Plus, a smoother road does not make as much noise. So we thought, why waste the money on federal money on having to build a road and walls? Why not do it in areas where there's not any sound impact, which is the intersection, and a vacant lot on the northwest corner. So that's kind of why we thought this was attractive. It gives us a little more, it extends our budget a little bit further throughout the whole project by bringing in some outside funds. It obviously has requirements that we would have to meet, the Buy American, Davis-Bacon, all the other things during construction. But we worked that out, so we bring somebody on to help us with that on that side of things. So I'm recommending it, and I'd like to hear you guys' input on it. I'd like to hear any questions that you might have as well.
Well, you already know how I feel about it. We've already had this discussion, so I'm in favor. I mean, it's a little unconventional, but it makes the most sense to get the best bang for our buck going forward. So, Councilmember Johnson?
I echo what the mayor said. I agree. I am for it.
What are the requirements of this funding? Meaning, does it have to be used for specific roadways?
Yes, when we put in the application, we have to define the limits of the project. So essentially, we would be defining it from the east side of the intersection through the west side of the Ehrlich property.
I apologize. That was not my question. I meant, does it have to be something like, it can't be neighborhood streets, it has to be a main thoroughfare, it can't be that sort of thing?
It has to be a regionally significant corridor.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, so we only have two, 37th and 65th Avenue.
Perfect. That's exactly what I was looking for. Thank you very much. I think it looks great.
Additional questions, comments?
I'm all for it.
Get it done.
There you go.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Great job.
Well, that is it for our work session. I know our council discussion will be on the next
Oh, yes, I forgot to
agenda.
change that.
So if anybody has anything for council, I will bring up one thing. Had an 85 corridor meeting a couple weeks ago, and one of the things that we were discussing, of course, is the topic of Spaghetti Junction. And they brought it back to us. They presented us their thoughts, their ideas. There's a couple bridges that are desperate need of repair and or replacement several years. It's a $240 million project. They're trying to find ways to fund it, trying to find ways to just improve it. Do they do it in phases? What's those phases look like? How long is it gonna be? Is it gonna be a 40, 50-year project before it gets done? There's still a lot of unknowns and uncertainties. However, though, they are going to be spending approximately, I think it was $1.6 million on stripage, sign improvement, and everything like that. Hopefully alleviate some of those issues that are there now. It's not gonna alleviate all, but hopefully it will do some type of improvement safety-wise in that corridor. So it was pretty good to find, at least know that they're gonna put some money to at least do that. So that's all I got.
What, yeah, I mean, that's horrible.
It
Just-
is.
I mean, we're putting lipstick on a pig. So, I mean, what happened to this big, huge national, bill that was supposed to throw a whole bunch of money into our infrastructure? And we can't get dilapidated bridges that are about to fall down
I-25.
fixed?
Yeah,
I mean,
I agree.
I-25.
it's unbelievable.
That was the priority, Steve. I-25.
Yeah. Just.
That's where all your money
One,
went.
one day, I'm gonna tell you, I think one day soon, we will have, I-95 there, where it collapses, tanker burns, whatever, and maybe we can get it repaired then, but I don't know, I think a Band-Aid of, hey, we're gonna stripe it for you, I mean, I don't even think they can get the stripes straight with all the potholes.
I wouldn't know that. Hey, and that was a lot of things that was brought up
We can
there.
circle
I mean, you share the concerns of everybody, all of us that are on that, committee, and unfortunately, CDOT just really doesn't have an answer.
Well, and that's,
They know.
it's gonna have to take
Yeah.
some action.
Right.
Do they have a design for it, a redesign
They
for
have-
it that's
No,
viable?
it's the same
They
design that
showed-
they've been peddling for the last
Yeah.
6 years.
They show the design,
Yeah.
like 6
It's
or
basically the
7 years
same
ago.
exact
Yeah.
design, just kind of, oh, look, now it's dated this date instead of,
Yeah.
2018, it's now dated 2023.
34.
Anyone else? Councilmember Johnson, anybody?
No, I have nothing. But I mean, just kind of, I agree with what was said. I mean, it's that Spaghetti Junction definitely needs some attention. But if we can at least get some kind of something happening there, at least, I mean, that's like the bare minimum that they're doing, but at least it's something. But I do agree that I hope nothing catastrophic happens there to have to force their hand to do something.
All right, well, if there's nothing else, we'll take a 23-minute break and we'll start probably at 7.
Oh my God.
Thanks, everybody.
Onions, horrible. Smelling the onions.
Record.